Welcome back to Open Heart Conversations, where we come together as community to explore the world's enduring spiritual and religious traditions. I'm your host, Reverend Renee Rossi. I'm so happy to be back with all of our viewers and listeners, and I'm here with my co-host, the Reverend Dr. Jose Miguel Roman. Jose, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
And we're very excited today. We are going to explore the topic of death with a licensed clinical social worker and an interspiritual minister, Leslie Ringbolt. Leslie, welcome to Open Heart Conversations.
Thank you, Renee. I'm really glad to be here. And hello, Jose. How are you?
Good to see you again, Leslie.
Yeah.
Jose, would you like to get us started?
I'd love to get us started. Just for purpose of complete transparency, Reverend Leslie Ringbolt is also a dean and has been a teacher at a premier interspiritual interfaith seminary, and it's where we met. And I had the pleasure of sitting in on one of her courses on death, and it was absolutely brilliant and transformative. It was extraordinary. And so I am so extraordinarily happy that this phenomenal teacher and spiritual soul is with us. So Leslie, I'll ask a rather broad question, but one that I think was a good way of starting us off. And that is, as someone who has studied this and served as minister around these issues, how would you define death?
So defining death is the whole deal here that we're going to be talking about, because as we explore it, we're really bringing light into all the areas of the definition. But to begin with, there are different deaths. There's physical, there's the intellectual part of it, there's the emotional part of it, there's the spiritual part of death. And they're all slightly different and some of them are substantially different depending on your view. And so they hold up this sort of issue that is death. So physically, to begin with, death is the cessation of life, which means really our hearts stop. So all the doctors that I've talked to say, we can give you all kinds of reasons why people die, but ultimately our hearts stop and we cease being a physical, viable being. That's the reality. That's a physical reality. And when we're immersed, as we so much are, into the material world, that's a place to start. There's all kinds of intellectual justifications for what that means and connections to things like loss and that sort of thing at the level of intellect. And we can try and bargain at that level with it. The emotional issue about death really does tie into those things that we love and that we believe that we're going to lose. As the Buddhists always tell us, everything we love, we lose. Actually, it's everything we've come in contact with, we lose. And at a spiritual level, there are so many possibilities as to what death is. Jose, it depends on the tradition that we come from. It depends on the experiences we've had at that spiritual level. So it can be a threshold. It can be an opening. It's certainly the start of something different than what we have just experienced. It may be the completion of a circle. It may be a point on a spiral. There's lots of ways of defining death.
So, Reverend Leslie, you mentioned loss. What is the relationship of loss to death?
So all losses, all losses are a piece of death. So we call small losses sort of a preparation for death, for this final thing. But all losses, from my first loss that I can remember, which is when my painted turtle crawled out of her container when I was 3 years old and she wandered off into the wilderness. I lost her. It was terrible. It's really my first big loss. To all the losses of identity, of of status, of connection, of relationship. There are all manner of losses, and they are aspects, right, of loss. They are particular forms of loss. Death being, at least at a material level, death being the final and absolute loss of the connections that we have had in this material world. So the connection is that the losses that we have are sort of like preparations ongoingly. How do we deal with them? How do we try and push through them? Do we try and distract ourselves from them? Do we go deeply into the loss and see how it feels, how it resonates with us? What do we do with that? What meaning do we make with it? But those are all the preparations for the things that is this big one time in this lifetime experience for us, which is death.
Reverend Leslie, what are some of the biggest fears that you find people have surrounding death?
Mm. Many people have fears around dying, and dying is the process, right, that leads up to this moment of death. And the fears, and this is borne out in research, the fears that most people have are at a material level. I'm afraid to go through the pain. I'm afraid of the suffering that this dying process might bring along. I'm afraid of, of losing control in some way. I'm afraid of, that I might not look well, that my body might not function the way I want it to. I'm afraid of leaving people behind in a state of that maybe they're not going to be taken care of in the way that if I were continuing to be there, they would be taken care of. I'm afraid of leaving an unfinished legacy, of having things left on my plate that I haven't done well, or I haven't done enough of, or things that I haven't begun. I'm afraid of losing those. So the process of leading up to death, those fears of sort of the unfinished life, partly, and also of this physical reality that we don't know how it'll be, are the things that people seem to most fear. When I've been with people, I've been fortunate in being with people who had thought through at pretty deep levels what their leaving this life would be like and what they wanted as much as they could know in advance, and that they had taken real steps to prepare for this and to really get ready as well as they could. And so when their active dying process came, many of the people that I've been with have been able to settle into, okay, well, this is what it's like. And then to be allowed to be in that interior space that they needed to be in, as their own death came closer and closer.
Mm-hmm. So it's really sounds like the process of dying really, invite somebody to be introspective and really look at all these different aspects of their life, not just the physical reality, but their relationships and the work they do and their legacy, as you said. Feels like a really important time in a person's life, the way you describe it.
Yeah, and it also just resonates with me that sometimes people fear what comes at them from their religious traditions. If the tradition that they have been, reared in and have sort of adhered to through their lives, depending on how that tradition puts death forward, that it might be imagined to be a very scary time, one of reckoning or accounting for failure or for, not getting it right in life. That can be kind of scary for people, to think that there's going to be not only judgment, but perhaps harsh punishment meted out in a way that says, it's kind of too late now. What else do I do? How do I manage this? So some people, um, I'm thinking of one person that I was with, and we were sort of able to quickly walk this through with some suggestions, but at for several days they were in deep fear of what's going to happen when I die, and the belief about what happens next was scary to them.
Mm-hmm. So we have what religion might teach someone. Is there anything else, like, we know for certain, when the heart stops at that moment of death, like, what do we know about that? Or is it all speculation or wonderings?
What we do know is what we can tell out of the material world. So we know what happens as vitality leaves the body. We know that there are those signs, and people who are trained in hospice work and is death doulas certainly know that and are able to predict for the people who are surrounding the person dying, that they can say, you can expect that this will happen and this will happen. And it's part of the leading up to where the body sort of pulls its resources closer and closer. So the resources that are left last are the heart and the brain. And that's why we actually see people with discoloration in their hands and feet and legs and arms, because the body is saying, I only have so much energy left. I'm going to put it where I think it has to be. And then after death, when the heart does stop, there are certain physical things that you can expect that will happen. And that's what we know for sure. After that, we don't know for sure. Some of us feel like we do know it for sure, but we don't actually know it for sure. And if you were to have to say, this is what I absolutely know in a court of law, you couldn't say anything about it. So the rest is conjecture at some level. Some of us feel that we have information that's provided in a from a multidimensional way that gives us enough information so that we're not totally freaked out and scared ourselves. But that again is, do I consciously, logically, no, not consciously, but do I logically know this? No. Is in conscious awareness, can I have some understanding? I believe we can. But that's different for everybody because our awareness is at in different places. So we don't know much about it.
So,
It's a big mystery.
Reverend Leslie, so given that mystery, what, as a student of death, what would you say, and a student of religion, what would you say spirituality and religion teach us about death?
How long do we have, Jose? Let's see. Because basically that's what they've been teaching. That's really, they teach us to live and to die. So depending on the manifestation of religion and at what level of awareness of religion that we have, there are some levels, as you and I, and you speak of this very well in your dissertation, but there are some levels of awareness about religion that is very literal and very clear and definite. And the clear definitions tend to be often descriptors that use the physical experience that is common to us and expand and to suppose what death will be like based on what our physical experience in this world has been. And so there are places, that can be described as hell holes or hell places, right? That are either very hot or very cold. They're very extreme. Our bodies wouldn't like it. We don't want to go there. And other places where, it's of ease and a paradise and we want to be there. And so there's some descriptions at those levels of religion. And as we move through other levels of awareness in a religious and spiritual way, we can move more from the material into the metaphysical. And as that arc happens, the description and expectation of what is next after death occurs, those descriptions get to be, I think, more expanded and certainly less provable.
When we look at spiritual and religious traditions, some of them are silent regarding death, but some of them do speak about death and the possibility of some level of continuation of consciousness, whether through you enter into some level of judgment or you enter into a reincarnation or there's some other dimension. But I've always had this sense that spirituality and religion often prepare us not so much to die, if you will, or death. But what they do is that they use death as almost a way of talking about how we should be living our life today. And so, in a sense, that's the preparation, but there's no direct preparation for death. It's really about, when you look at death from a religious perspective, it's about look at death and then go backwards and decide how you're going to live your life. Do spirituality and religion speak of death itself? Do they prepare us, if you will, for death? And if so, how?
I believe that what religion would like to do in that sort of reflexive way that you just identified is to say, possibly without even saying it overtly, is that what happens after death is a continuation of what's going on in life. Because if what might happen after death can be impacted by what's going on in this lifetime, then at some level, there is a sense that there's a continuity, right? That there's a piece that weaves through, that we don't quite understand what it is or how it works, but that it's happening, that there is a continuation of consciousness, which, sort of is what the physicists tell us, right? That we don't lose, matter doesn't go away, it just changes shape. Energy doesn't go away, it just shows up in some new form. And I think that is what religion tries to deal with without sounding sort of hocus pocusy. It says, that there is some way that we influence what happens after death by what we're doing in life. So it becomes a motivation for ethic. And in and of itself, obviously, a good life is a good thing to do. And in addition, there's this little pull, right, that says, and also you might be able to influence what's next by living a good life, a skillful life, to use that terminology from another tradition. So, yes, I believe that it does. I don't think that they speak of it directly. And I don't actually know why that's true, but it is clear that there isn't much said in many traditions. I mean, there are some that don't really speak of it at all. And there are some that say, okay, here is the preparation for death. For example, Tibetan Buddhism, you start learning at a very young age. How are you to prepare for this next phase? And this is the practice that you use. And the practice that you use is in this lifetime. So there is this continuity, but we don't exactly know how it happens. And I think that's our reality. We don't know how it happens. It's like those speed bumps in a parking garage. They get to you and they say, don't back up because there's severe tire damage. I think that's what death is. Death is like that. You can't back up.
It's funny. What I find is that in the Abrahamic traditions, the Jewish faith seems to be relatively silent. the Christian and Islamic faiths tend to have a much more developed conversation about death, but it's always, again, exactly as you said, looking back and using it as a way of telling us how we should be living our lives today. I do think you're also correct. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition is most likely the only one where, I mean, the Bartle Todo is literally a book that tells you exactly what to expect the 40 days right after dying, right? When you're
Correct.
in death and you're in this, what they call this state in between here and whatever there is, nirvana, if you will. But it's fascinating. It's a fascinating dialogue. It'd be really interesting to see how all of the faiths actually treat death, and it's that would be an interesting subject.
I have some notes. I'll share them with you sometime. I started to do that because it was sort of like, well, this one goes all the way through, and this one doesn't speak of it. And and the other thing is that in terms of ancient texts, the Egyptian Book of the Dead also has some fairly clear messages about how we ought to live, so that we can also do this very clear preparation of the recently dead for what's next. So yes, depending on the tradition, there is something that's said. In many indigenous traditions, the idea of us being in a cycle of life, death, rebirth, and ongoingly all the time is quite clearly there, without any fuss, that we should live a good life and we should do these things because we should live a good life, and that's what you do. And at the end of this period of time, at the end of this season, we shake off this particular manifestation and we go into something next.
Leslie, we spoke a bit about, what physically happens when we die, and, the spiritual perspective, just the tip of the iceberg of the spiritual perspective of what we, think and what we may have learned or taught. You had mentioned some other aspects of death earlier, and I'm hoping you can speak a bit more about that. Like, what happens emotionally when we die? Like, what's that component to this experience?
So that one, it's a lot of self-report on that. And again, my experience and from what I've read, it really does seem as though we die as we live. And so for people who are emotionally expressive, they're going to be emotionally expressive in their dying. And they can be, very sad about missing people. They can be very joyful for the possibility of greeting loved ones, or of going on to what is next in an exploratory and curious way. People who have not been emotionally forthcoming so much in their lives are probably not going to be different as they die. When I remember somebody who, was sort of a classically reserved person who people really didn't know how they were feeling much in their lives, and they were in their dying process, asking them how they were doing got you kind of a one-word answer of, I'm okay, I'm fine, it's all right. So I think that, again, this continuity piece, right? We are the people we are as we go through this. And because the energy at the time of dying comes inward, naturally it comes inward. As I said, physically, that's a thing that happens. The energy goes inward, as well as where our attention goes. Attention comes inward as well. It's not so much about the external world anymore. And so the emotions that are being experienced, if people choose to talk about them, are the ones that you might expect. I'm going to be sad to miss you. I don't know what's going to happen. A lot of I don't knows come up. And people have various reactions to that over their lives. If you're a person who says, I don't know, and wow, that's kind of cool, I don't know, and I'm curious, then you may still be, I don't know, and this is kind of fun. And if you're the kind of person for whom I don't know brings up fears, you may not know and now be fearful as well. So I haven't seen, and I'm not a huge expert on this by any means. There are people who've seen this, but even in talking to like hospice nurses and palliative care people, there's not a report that people are extremely different in their emotional lives as they die than as they lived.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want that final message from somebody who's been really very quiet and personal and inward in their lives, that might not be something that's fulfilled for you, that you get a testimony at the end of how deeply, they feel. It just may not happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering also, you mentioned that there's a belief about we perhaps go to different dimensions when we die. So can you expand on that a bit? Like, what does that mean?
Who knows? I don't know exactly. Right? I don't know. I'll use metaphor, and language is all metaphor, right? So this is a metaphor. I do experience more dimensions than the three that we're in on this planetary phase, and I do that through regularly through meditation, and I don't know. I call it dreaming. And sometimes journeying, and there are awarenesses that I have that are not immediately locatable on this particular plane on this planet. So in my life, I experience what I will call a multidimensional possibility. It is what people are looking for and achieving when they use plant medicines and psychedelics. That is another way of getting there. There are many ways, and humans seem to have been doing this for our whole history of upstepping our consciousness. In doing work around death, I've done a lot of work in the history of human consciousness and how consciousness studies are evolving. And there, again, in the last 2 decades, there has just been an explosion. It stems off of work that has been done in a sort of a perennial fashion over a very long time. What we seem to be saying is that consciousness is really not limited, and that we can move to the fringe of consciousness. And as we do that, that something is being created as we move in that dimension. So the edge of the universe, the edges of the multiverses, we can get there in consciousness with practice. And some people have no interest in that kind of hoo-hooey stuff at all. And some people really like to do that. And that's fine. We don't have to. It's just a possibility that consciousness doesn't have a limit. That what we're here to explore as limitless beings are the dimensions of limits here, which is the materiality that we have in this state, looking like we do. We have limits, and the only way that a limitless being could experience limits is to take on that cloak, right? To take on the cloak of materiality so that we have limits. So this is really the experiment, I think, not the limitless. The limitless is our home base. The experiment here is where we are now, is experiencing time, space dimensions, not in going beyond that. So that it's that the unknown is really more here and the known is really there. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but
it does. It brings up questions, and so if we believe, or we believe that our consciousness continues on after death. So, would it be possibly true to say that our consciousness is going to a new dimension, or maybe our consciousness is already is in all dimensions, and it's just that okay.
There you go.
Okay,
There you
answer
go.
my own question.
There you go. Great question, great answer. As we posit these things, right, it becomes like, oh, yeah, well, maybe we're not only here. I mean, maybe we can be. Maybe we can sort of shut off close off the curtains around us, and we can say, I'm going to stay in this right now and really experience these four walls. I'll experience these four walls for a while. And then sometimes it's like, yeah, I just want to go back and see what else is there again. Am I still in connection with that? And for many people, because it's I think it's one of the great uncharted conversations that we could have with one another. How many people have experienced multidimensional reality in this lifetime and think that talking about it is crazy? And that if they say things to other people, that people will go, "Ooh, and are you off your meds now?" And I think that, the more people I come in contact with, and I say, well, that doesn't strike me as odd at all. It strikes me as, you know, I, I expect that happens. More and more people say, well, I've had this experience, or I've gotten this knowledge that I had no way of knowing, or I had this connection with somebody and it felt like I could connect with somebody on the other side of the world, which I love. That's a practice I love. I love going to someone on another side of the world and saying, let's be in contact and let's have a connection. And there's somebody on the other side of the world who's doing the same thing. There we are in connection. So yeah, we are in all dimensions all the time, but I think we can turn off the awareness of it.
Which brings up then the idea of the near-death experience, right? NDEs. What is a near-death experience?
Well, my teacher, Raymond Moody, Double Doc Raymond Moody, created that terminology several decades ago as he was studying this experience called death. A near-death experience is, as it says, it's near death. It's not death. It's typically an experience that happens through physical trauma, and that includes medical trauma, which happens all the time when we get on a surgery table. We get cut open, we get put out so that we don't feel pain, and sometimes we get very near death. It's the classic description of I'm separated from my body. Sometimes I'm up in a corner or over on another side of the room, and I can actually see my physical body and know that I'm separate from that. Perhaps it is people talk about going down a dark tunnel with a light at the end, and as they get closer, there are various experiences and feelings that they have as they do that, and a sense of you could go farther, and sometimes do you want to go farther? Do you want to return? And people who obviously tell us about their near-death experiences say that they chose to return. When they return, the common experience, not totally, but a common experience is that people no longer have a fear of death and of what's next. They have a sense that things were going to be okay and that they will be taken care of, and that they're returning to a place that feels solid for them. There are some people who don't have a good experience in near-death experiences and who have what I would call sort of a bardo experience, if I were going back to the Tibetan notion, where it's very disruptive. And they also, obviously, when we hear from them, have returned. That near-death experience is understood by many people to be a common experience, and it's been studied a lot in the last 30, 40 years. Yeah. And if you want to read more about it, I mean, Ray Moody and his and the people that he's coached and trained have much to say about it. And there's a lot of work going on now. There's a conference every year about near-death experiences, and if anyone wants to know about that, there's really so much out there, and it's really lovely to listen. Children also report near-death experiences, by the way.
Reverend Leslie, now I'm relying on your spiritual intuition, if you will, and maybe even spiritual imagination, when I ask the following question, which is, what do you think the near-death experience teaches us about death?
That there is really something else that is real beyond this reality, beyond this physical material reality, that there is something else there. And that the something else that is there is, I feel it from a tactile sense, is warm, is holding, is welcoming, most of the time. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's scary and but most of the time, most people say, well, there's clearly something beyond only this experience. And so if the common thread could be pulled through, I think it's that there's something beyond.
Reverend Leslie, knowing that, as a human, as a living, breathing person, we're all guaranteed a death, right? Like
Guaranteed.
Guaranteed. So it amazes me just saying that, thinking of how little we talk about it, which is, what the conversation we were having earlier. But I'm wondering, like, how should we manage that time in our lives? Like what can we do to face death and to face loss? Like, is there a guidebook? Is there, like, what would be your best advice for a person who is going to die, which is every single one of us?
Everybody. One of the things I encourage people to do is to write down all the losses that they've had so far. Big, little, important, unimportant, still painful, not painful anymore, whatever. Just write it down. I suggest people get a long piece of paper and put, birth someplace and put current someplace so that you have a perspective. And the older you get, the longer the paper is probably going to be, probably guaranteed for that. Some people experience loss before their birth in this lifetime. So that's why you don't start with the edge of the paper. You start someplace on the paper, because some people have an experience of loss before the actual birth experience. But you write all that down. Just write it all down. No judgment. Write it down. And then sit with that for a while. And notice how you feel or how you don't feel. No judgment again, just to notice. I believe we do this best as we do most things in life with other people. So I would say get a buddy or two. Get somebody who would also be willing to do this for themselves and do it together. And you do that stage first. Just write that thing out. And then look at that list. And then perhaps pick something. And not the most extreme, deepest loss that you've had, not the most life-changing one. Don't pick that to start with. Pick something else. And then talk to this little group of people that you have to say, what was it? What did you lose? From your perspective now, what was it? Like when I talk about my painted turtle, I could tell you a whole bunch of details about my painted turtle and how I felt, and that I had expected that she would just like to be out in the grass. That's why I wanted to let her out. And that something happened, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I turned around and I went into the house for a minute, and I came back out and I couldn't find her. And they're little, right? They don't move that fast, but I couldn't find her. And so I can remember going through the tears and, everything. I can remember it vividly. And what that taught me, it taught me to be really careful about letting people run free. That's what it taught me. It took me a long time to just go back to what my father said. Who said, "It's okay. It's okay. You can be free." But it was a thing when I was little. I remember that. And so as we learn, what did we learn from here's a loss? What did I learn from it? How did I incorporate that in my life? Am I still holding on to that same belief? Have I shifted that belief? You can do that throughout this list until you really get a sense of how do I deal with losses? And then you say, okay, next phase. We've talked about losses in general and maybe some specifics and how I've dealt with it. Let me bring death in. And then we start with, what was my first encounter with death? For me, the biggest one was my grandmother died when I was 5. And how did I deal with that? And my father died when I was 9. And how did I deal with that? And then there have been these deaths. And what do I think about my own? At some point we do that, but it's a process. It's a discovery process of how I deal with loss, how then if I use death as the loss I'm dealing with, how I want to go with that. I think that because we know it's going to come, we just don't know when it's going to come. It seems like a prudent thing to start now. Since I don't know if it's going to be, well, for me, it won't be 50 years, trust me, but it could be 50 years or it could be 50 minutes. And we don't know. So why don't we get going on it so that we can have the best experience with the most possible curiosity we can have? That's what I'd say.
And that sounds so healing. That sounds so supportive. Like all of your life experiences are informing you in some way, maybe to prepare you for your own death. That's how I'm interpreting what you're saying. Like that, it feels like something to marvel at. Like it's all part of getting you ready.
Yeah, it's all part of getting us ready. And the additional pieces that I haven't brought in is that, loss is painful because we loved something, right? It's a measure of our love of something, the pain that we feel when we've lost. So if a person, leaves my life and goes elsewhere and I don't see them again and I wasn't really close to them, I go, oh yeah, I miss them. Wish I could see him again. And it goes down maybe about this far down into my being. When I love someone deeply and that person dies, or even if they go away and I don't end up seeing them again, I carry the missing always, right? And so it's both a how I've dealt with loss, but also how do I hold the love that I have? And so it's richer. It's richer than only dealing with loss. It's the richness of the expansion of love. So that's also part of it. And haven't said that, but when I talk about consciousness expanding to the edges of the multiverse, that's a sort of a pseudo astrophysical way of saying the same thing that poets talk about when they talk about what happens in love, which is that it's infinite expansion. So we're saying the same thing in 2 different sets of metaphors here.
Mm-hmm.
And if I return to that other set of dimensions, I'm returning to that big expansion, which is that I'm returning to love.
Mm. I planned to ask you next why loss is difficult for some and easy for others. And I feel like, now I want to throw that question out. And the question is like, what does love have to do with death, which you just explained? Like, that's the question. It's not about, because, as difficult as loss can be, it's directly related to what you're saying, to your love and your connection. And so in a way, the more difficult the loss, the more beauty and the more tenderness and the more important it was in your life.
Yes, exactly. And there's a belief that comes out of the A Course in Miracles that only love is the thing that's real and everything else isn't. So when you look at it from that point of view, through that lens of that metaphysics, then what we're saying is, the loss wasn't the thing, although we look at the loss, but the love was the thing that was there, right? So when people go like this and get scared and are afraid, and there's a notion of fear around death, that's not real. If there's enough time, if people would actually prepare around this big milestone that we all go through, we go through 2 milestones: birth, death. We go through those 2 milestones. At some level, we probably prepare for our birth, depending on, again, how your philosophy works. There is a preparation for that, but we clearly can go through a preparation for dying and for our death that is not not resistant and we have to go there and I got to get there, but really a pull to say, how do I live my life fully in love and move continuously on into the next space of expansion and love? Yeah, I would say that they're definitely tied, and that's really why I look at death at all.
I once had the privilege of seeing a conversation between 2 people. One of whom was a young man who was a nurse who worked in a hospice, worked with men, women, and persons who were dying. And the person who was having a conversation with him said, what did you learn? What has been one of the great learnings that you've done? And he said, it's amazing. I've been with people, every type of person you can think of, no matter what age, ethnicity, race, social strata. I've been with the rich and the poor. I've been with every manner of human being that you can think of. And he said, the vast majority of those persons who were going through this process, the vast majority, were basically asking themselves only 2 questions. And the first was, how much have I loved? And the second, how much was I loved? That it's interesting how when you're there, when you're really at, the old saying goes, at death's door, that those become love literally becomes the question.
Yes.
And love becomes what it's all about. You literally ask yourself, not how wealthy I was, famous, but how much did I love and how much was I loved?
Yes.
Right?
Right. And the how much did I love is, like, how can I open myself towards you? It's even scarier to say, how much would I open myself to let you come towards me? There's a thing that we go through there as well. So again, such a good piece from that nurse, Jose. But I think that we miss the whole point if we don't get to where we are right now. If we can continue to say, what is death and how do we deal with death? Death is only makes any sense in connection with life, and life only makes any sense in connection with love. Right. And so those are, it sounds cliche-ish, and it is, I guess, but there we go.
funny. I was going to ask you about questions and answers in this space, but let me change that question a little bit and then ask you, what does death teach us about life? If we
Everything
treat
we
death
need to
as a
know.
teacher.
Everything we need to know. Everything we need to know. There's a wonderful little experiment that some workshop presenters will go through with people. And that's the, okay, so we all know we're going to die, and we're going to go through this exercise. And so you go to your doctor and you get the word that you have 3 months to live. So write down everything you're going to do in 3 months, everything that you want to do, everything that you intend to do in 3 months. So you give people, 5 minutes to do that. Then you come back and you say, okay, well, you went to the doctor again, and there is more news. And the news is you have 3 weeks to live. Write down everything you're going to do in 3 weeks. And you give people 2-3 minutes to do that. You say, when they come back, you say, I'm really sorry. You've gotten a call from your doctor. You have 3 days to live. What will you do in those 3 days? When you go through that process, you start out with a list that's, and it gets smaller and smaller. And at the end, most people will say, I'm going to call my beloveds around me, and I'm going to put them all around me. And I want to touch them and have them touch me. That's all I want. So what are we really saying, right? I want to be in a place of love. I want to show it and get it as much as possible.
So you're really getting at my next question, which is, how can someone prepare for death?
At some level, we're doing it consciously or unconsciously our entire lives. If we want to make it conscious, which is hopefully the point of having discussions like this, is to bring it more into consciousness, then we do as much as we can to bring life fully into consciousness, right? What am I doing? How come I'm doing it? What am I learning? Do I want to have that experience again? What are the critical experiences that I want? And if I could keep every once in a while that notion of 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, if I could bring that to consciousness every once in a while and then live out of that awareness, so that it wasn't this notion of achieving. I mean, that's important and that's fine. And you can do that. And that, that's like one channel of your life. The other channels, can be, and how do I create this level of connection with others, whether humans or non-humans? My piece will be that I'm going to go outside, and people are going to come with me outside, because I want to be on Mother Earth. That's where I want to be, because that's important to me. And I want my puppy dog around me and all those things. How do I make sure that I'm doing that? Whatever that is that you would do in 3 days. And so, yeah, I think that's how we prepare. To some extent, we have to bifurcate the life in the daily realm. We have to do practice around the practice of dying, living well and dying. That's why, the last little book that I read recently, again, for like the 4th time, was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. It's living and dying, right? It's not the Tibetan Book of Dying. It's the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying that's out most recently. So it's both and, to see them as 2 sides. If I have this side, I've got to have that side. I'm going to have that side if I have had this side. Just become aware.
Reverend Leslie, I'm wondering, based on all that you're sharing with us, and particularly on this idea of love being, the thing that we're talking about. So how would you define grief in relationship to that?
Interestingly, I just did a class this weekend where that's what the topic was grief. And grief is the emotion that comes from loss. So it's like missing. Grief is missing is a kind of a grief. It's that connection, right? It's the connection because we loved. It's the realization of, oh, this is how it feels when that's no longer immediately present to me. And there is this peace in grief that is longing. There's a longing part of it, which is like a missing piece. So those are the aspects of it. There's a whole wonderful world to explore in how grief happens. And I really love the work of Frances Weller in The Wild Edge of Sorrow, expanding as he did grief from the kind of thing we've been talking about, the loss of people or our identities or something like that, and into this richer field of, the woes of the world and what our ancestors' legacy is to us in terms of grieving and things that I know I wanted, that I should have gotten, but that I didn't get. For example, in our culture, it's a lot very easily understood as, I really wanted community in my life, and our culture really doesn't provide that, and what that loss is for us. And also the things that we're ashamed of, the aspects of ourselves that we exile into a shame place. And that once we kind of come to awareness that we've been doing that, there's grief there. So Weller's work is so rich. I love it. I just love it. And moving into how we do and what components of grief are is very rich too. Part of this study of, love and grief and loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I feel like, grief makes people uncomfortable. Well, not everyone, but certainly the longer a person is grieving, the more sometimes people will pull away because,
Sure.
And so there's this idea of, when we're talking about grief and loss and death, like, how important or how valuable is comfort? Like, should you be comfortable with all of these things? Is that the goal, or is that even possible?
Well, it's certainly possible. I try to steer clear of shoulds. It's available for people to become comfortable with these, with the experiences that actually they're having. It's really hard to be a very old human on this planet without having run into these things. And so how we help children through grief, how we help children through loss, how we help children understand that it's all about love, can start there. And if something feels overwhelming, I had a loss in my life that was so overwhelming that I went amnesic for 6 months. That wasn't voluntary. My system said, she can't handle this now. She can't handle it, and took me out. And I woke up and, started down a path. I don't think anybody can tell another human being how to do grief. We do it individually, and we do it at the level of resource that we have at the moment. So when children, appear not to be taking something on, it's okay. Parents go to clergy and to therapists and to other parents and say, my kid is not grieving. They're not crying. They just lost their beloved grandmother. It's like, okay, they're not crying. It's okay. Deal with your own stuff. Let your child, this might be just way too much for them. They don't They don't have words, so they can't tell you. Doesn't mean they're not grieving. They miss their grandma. And they may not be able to do anything more than just touch it once in a while and say, I miss her. Boom, I'm going to go out and play now. And we're all like that child. We just have different things that we do. So I would say if grief has gone on for multiple years and a person has not been able to get back into their own life, then I would say that we need to help them with some resources so that they can return to their own life. But most people are doing grief and their lives, and they may just not be as fully into their prior life as before, but that's because life has changed for them. And so you can't expect that they're going to go back to being it. Sometimes there's a loss of identity when we lose someone we love. When somebody we love dies, in my case, was I a mother anymore because my child had died? I wasn't. And I had to grieve the loss of my identity as well as missing him. So that when people say, well, have you ever been a parent? I don't ever know what to answer to that. Was I? Yes. But they didn't ask that. They said, are you? Well, no. And then they think you don't have the experience you have. And if you say yes, then they start asking questions about, a living child. And then that gets awkward. So grief comes up. We all do it differently. I think our big lack in our culture is that we do it on our own. We don't understand that we need to pull in our whatever our tribe is. We need to pull in our tribe in order to grieve well, in order to have the support and to have the mirroring and everything else that we need in grief. There are grief rituals that are wonderful to take part in, and people ought to avail themselves of those if they are experiencing a deep grief. So I guess that's it about grief.
Reverend Leslie, you've actually begun to kind of answer my question, which is, what are the qualities that I should consider cultivating in myself that would be helpful in dealing with death and loss? What are the qualities or capacities that I should consider cultivating that will help me to face loss and death? Obviously, one of them seems to be to cultivate community around me. What would be other qualities?
Absolutely. Community is really important. And that doesn't have to be, huge numbers of people. We're really talking about one or two other humans that can mirror back to us. So it doesn't have to be, go off and start a commune somewhere. It really can be just trusted people. I think that for me, the what I remember to cultivate is humor. Not like ha ha funny, although sometimes that too, but really the humor that is balance, that there is loss because there was love. So that's a balance. That there is sadness because there had been joy. That there is disconnection because there had been connection. To keep seeing that there's a balance here. So I'm feeling bereft, but that's because I had felt full, right? So to be able to hold a balance, and that's the humor piece of it, to be able to see the other side, to be able to see what else is there, and to be willing to counter the current narrative that has a way that we're supposed to grieve. I mean, I had a student a couple of years ago whose husband of 42 years died pretty suddenly with just a month or two of notice in an illness. And after 3 years, she had rarely gone out, and this was not because of the lockdown of COVID. She had not gone out. She had not engaged with her church community. She had barely connected with her friends at all. And people were really worried And at some point, I don't know, something came up to me and I made some sort of really off the wall remark. uh, not not really correct for a reverend, I think, to have said, or for a therapist to have said. And she started laughing because it was kind of so absurd, right? And from that, she started to move. Just because she said, I'd never considered that I could be loyal and true to my love for him and move on in the world. It had never occurred to her. She'd just been holding one side. She wasn't balanced in it. And I thought, yeah, there it is. Both and. So I would say that the capacity to really hold on to is, this possibility and the balance that there can be. Not a lot. Maybe I would say curiosity, fearlessness.
Um, I'm also wondering, Reverend Leslie, like what made you interested in these topics of death and loss? How did you get here?
A lot of loss and many deaths. It started to seem pretty inevitable that I needed to look at this because it just kept coming back into my face. And I'm kind of an adventurer. I like to do things that I haven't done before, and this is something I haven't done yet. And so I want to, and when I go on a trip someplace, when I travel, I like to try to know a lot about the place. So I learn its history and I try to get involved with, a little bit of the culture as I can when I'm not there. And I talk to people who maybe, have gone a little bit to that place. And I really try to prepare when I go on a trip. And this seems like a trip to go on. And so I come because I'm curious.
I love that. I'm so grateful that you're curious and that you're sharing this with us. I am so curious about so many things that I've thought about death and still think about. And I am certain our viewers and our listeners are also going to be asking themselves some questions too. So for those who want to learn more about your work, Leslie, and dive into this deeper with you or learn from you, work with you, how can they do that?
Well, they could certainly contact me. I have a website. It's insideouthealinghappens.com, and they can certainly come to that website, can call me through that. My number is listed. My email is listed. I am always in the process of doing additional teachings, both in small groups and also now, thankfully, back in person. So I'm grateful for the fact that we can get back out into the world. So there are several ways that people could contact me if they wanted to.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because I know people are going to be curious, and I'm so grateful to you for this beautiful conversation. You shared so much wisdom and insight and just things to be curious about. I think you sparked a lot of curiosity in me, and I think that's really important when we're talking about these huge topics that feel overwhelming at times, and that we don't know a lot about sometimes. So I'm very grateful for your time and your energy and just all that you've shared with us today.
I'm so happy to have been here with both of you. It's really been a pleasure. And if we talk again in another year, I'm sure there'll be more things that have happened and that we're aware of that we weren't aware of even right now. So let's keep the conversation going.
Yes.
Absolutely. And it may take a lot less than a year to represent. Thank you so much.
All right.
Yes,
Take care.
Reverend Jose, thank you so much for being here with us again. We love having you here with us. And to all of our viewers and listeners, thank you for participating in Open Heart Conversations. Until next time.